I think it's safe to say that just about every gamer on the planet knows about the Halo franchise, originally designed by Bungie. But I'm willing to bet that a lot of people didn't know that Marathon was in fact Bungie's very first FPS game that has a lot of Easter eggs and shares a lot of similar lore notes as Halo. It was launched in 1994 as a Macintosh exclusive. That's right, a game you could originally only play on an Apple computer. And if you have heard the name Marathon recently, it's because Bungie is rebooting the franchise as an extraction shooter. But why try and reboot such an old IP that frankly isn't that well known? Today we're going to dive into the original Marathon and see if we can answer that question. Now, back in the early 90s when Wolfenstein and Doom first hit the scene, there was an FPS gold rush to start making similar titles and get them to the market as soon as possible. Marathon was part of this gold rush, and it looks very similar with voxel-based enemies and pixelated texture mapping, though calling Marathon a Doom clone wouldn't really be fair to the differences that it brought. Unlike Doom's open corridors and nearly plotless level progression, Marathon is mostly set in the cramped interior of a massive spaceship. Its narrative is told between the artwork that's shown off between sections, and you can also get more information through the text logs and directions that you get from terminals. The combat is certainly slower paced compared to its much gorier predecessor, and it's focused more on picking enemies off at a distance versus mowing them down with a super shotgun. It also has a few tech advantages, like being one of the early games to actually render in proper 3D space. Doom uses interesting technology that sort of uses a lot of clever tricks to make the game look 3D, but the levels are actually designed on a 2D surface. And this prevented them from having rooms being placed on top of one another. But Marathon used an in-house engine developed by Bungie that was fully 3D and had a lot of cool features like dynamic lighting, texture mapping, free look, and more advanced rooms. That said, its tech quickly started to fall behind as engines like the Build engine, which powered Duke Nukem 3D, quickly started to advance past its technology. Now, Marathon did actually have multiplayer with custom-made multiplayer maps, though it was limited to local networks, which was pretty common at the time. You had to be on the exact same router as somebody to play against them, so LAN parties essentially. Now, while Marathon had a brief moment of technological superiority in the market, its narrative was actually pretty darn innovative compared to its competition. The game's use of artwork and terminal text actually tells a pretty complex story. The ship you spend most of the game exploring is the Marathon, an interstellar colony ship, and you're guided by one of the ship's 3 AIs via terminals. But one of those AIs was corrupted by the Spit, a race of cyborgs, and this caused absolute chaos on the ship. You play as a security officer that's arrived on the Marathon via a shuttle. You're from a nearby colony planet. The rest of the story is mostly about the AIs fighting each other and the other alien races involved in the overall conflict. The game actually has a pretty deep backstory if you start to piece it all together, which includes disgruntled Martian settlers, rebellions, political organizations, intergalactic slavery, and of course nuclear war. It's clear Bungie was already envisioning the future of the sci-fi FPS genre and establishing a solid foundation for it. And going back and actually playing the original game for this video was a trip on its own. The controls and general design of the game are just more primitive versions of the same FPS games we play today. Aiming has weird acceleration limits where you shoot is generally where your shots go, but it also does feel like the game is pretty generous with some auto aim to ensure that you can hit those enemies, and the terminals provide step-by-step instructions which you kind of have to memorize to progress. It's exactly what a lot of modern gamers now crave. And even despite the limitations of Marathon just due to the tech of its time, it's still impressively competent and a compelling game to play today, which really speaks to Bungie's history of competent game design. Now, one thing that kind of stood out to me when comparing it to other games of the era is the almost cartoonish design of the enemies. Where games like Doom and Duke Nukem kind of leaned into sort of a more realistic, gritty tone, Marathon's enemies are clean and brightly colored and kind of exotic looking in a way that makes them feel almost like they were ripped right out of the pages of a Star Wars concept art book. In fact, some of the armor on these characters looks very similar to some of the elites in, say, Halo. I don't know how well the cartoony style comes across in this genre, but it's certainly different and set it apart for the time. Now, Bungie actually released 2 more Marathon games, Marathon 2 and Marathon Infinity, that continued the original game's story and greatly expanded on both the franchise's lore and its engine technology. However, after the success of Halo in 2001, it seemed like Marathon became a distant memory both for gamers and seemingly Bungie as well. In 1999, they released the source code for Marathon 2, which led to a community-developed open-source version of the engine and eventually a proper port for all 3 games to PC earlier this year. One of the more interesting things about Marathon's legacy, though, is that despite it getting put on ice by Bungie, many of its concepts and assets were carried forward into the Halo franchise. Rogue AIs, ancient civilizations, an invasion that threatens all life in the universe. You name it, Marathon has it. There's also dozens of references and Easter eggs in Halo that pull directly from Marathon. They're certainly closely related franchises in almost every way, except for, well, just the actual plot points of the story. But just scrolling through a list of all the callbacks and shared assets on Halo's fan wiki, it's clear that the soul of Marathon has lived on in Halo. So when Bungie announced that a new Marathon game was in development and it would be a PvP extraction shooter, a lot of fans were left kind of scratching their heads. Marathon was never a multiplayer first experience. It was also a very lore heavy franchise. In fact, that was the main thing that set it apart from its competitors at the time. And it's not to say that extraction shooters can't have good lore and narrative, but they usually take a pretty far back seat to the gameplay and extraction mechanics. Now, the Marathon trailer does include several callbacks to the lore of the original games. It features the original Marathon ship that served as the setting for the first game. There's a shot of the Svit compiler enemy model, which was one of the key antagonists on the first game and an enemy that you fought frequently. There's also several logos seen throughout the Marathon series, but beyond these callbacks, leaks are suggesting that the game will be a 4-class hero shooter with in-depth weapon customization, a loot system similar to Hunt Showdowns with a smaller pool of important items and not a sprawling list of hundreds of items like you might find in Tarkov. So it sounds like this new Marathon game will mostly be located in the Marathon universe, but otherwise probably an entirely new take on combat and how they deliver a narrative to the player base. Now, while doing the research for this video, I was reminded by how many Marathon callbacks there are in other Bungie games like Destiny. A notable one is the Mida multi-tool, which has lore around it referencing a crashed ship on Mars. And the Mida name is actually a direct reference to the Martian Revolutionary Government from Marathon. So it's clear that Bungie is still a fan of the foundational lore of the Marathon series and is kind of Easter egging it throughout its titles. And while the original fan base for Marathon is probably pretty small by comparison to other major IPs, they do seem hungry for a proper expansion of the series made with modern tools and talent. Fan projects utilizing the open source version of Marathon 2's engine are still coming out today, and the gameplay that I've been using for this video is from a Steam release created by the community. And some of the fan-made scenarios like Red or Apotheosis X are basically fully fledged games set within the Marathon universe with their own art, lore, locations, and weapons. It's cool to see that the community carried on the legacy that was for so long abandoned by Bungie, but it's hard to imagine that this upcoming extraction shooter is what that fan base wants from the series, but maybe it'll lead to more Marathon content in other forms. Nobody knows if this Marathon reboot will be Bungie's next Destiny-like success story, but despite Bungie's more recent fumblings with different franchises and Sony drama and all that stuff, for the most part all of their major IPs have become huge successes, and the studio is now under immense pressure to hit another home run, but the extraction shooter market seems incredibly risky. The newness of the genre has more or less completely faded, and the market is very saturated, so trying to break into it and claim your own chunk of it is going to be hard. And the world of Marathon hasn't really been exposed to a lot of gamers, so it's hard to see if the weight of that IP is going to help them in this regard. That said, the world is very rich, it has a lot of interesting lore and aliens and conflicts, so pulling from that lore could add a lot of depth to the gameplay, I guess, or the background to the gameplay. Hopefully that'll come through in their next title. Of course, I'm very curious to see what Bungie comes up with, just because they're such a legendary company at this point, and any new IP is exciting, or reboot of an old IP, I should say. What do you guys think, though? Did you ever play the original Marathon? Are you fans of the Marathon and the lore and the legacy, or is this all new to you? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave me a like, subscribe for more content like it, and ding that notification bell to beat the YouTube algorithm with me. Next up, check out this video on a game called Forever Winter, another game that is heavily drenched in lore. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.